I used to think I'd witnessed every imaginable horror on the job. Murders, overdoses, violent, domestic disputes. It hardened me, made me numb to the worst humanity could offer. Ghosts. And demons, though? Those were bedtime stories for children and gullible thrill-seekers. I never believed in them until that night. That night changed everything. The call from dispatch came just past midnight. A simple noise complaint in a sleepy, suburban neighborhood whose residents were probably tucked in and dreaming. My partner, let's call him Paul, and I, Mike, assumed it'd be a quick in and out. Tell someone to keep it down, file a standard report, move on. But from the moment we pulled onto the dimly lit street, something felt wrong. The silence was too complete, too absolute. Street lamps flickered ominously, casting distorted shadows across sidewalks. The houses loomed like silent sentinels, their windows tightly shuttered, as if the entire block was holding its breath. We parked in front of the house. It was a modest, single-story place, paint peeling at the edges, the lawn overgrown with weeds. No light shone from inside, no porch light, no flicker of a TV glow. We stepped out of our cruiser, the crunch of gravel underfoot sounding, deafening in the hush. Paul glanced at me, and I could see a glint of unease in his eyes. "This address looks abandoned," he muttered, though we both knew the complaint must have come from a neighbor. We approached the door, and I knocked firmly. "Police," I announced. "Is anyone home?" For a moment, nothing happened. I was about to knock again when the door creaked open a few inches, enough to reveal a young girl peering out. She couldn't have been older than 8 or 9, hair tangled, eyes wide. She stared at us in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Hey there," I said gently, crouching down to meet her gaze. "Is your mom or dad around? A guardian, maybe?" She shook her head, the motion slow and deliberate. Something about her face, her posture, made the skin on my arms prickle. Usually, a kid home alone would look scared or worried. But this one, she just looked blank. I cleared my throat, fighting off a sudden chill. "Okay, well," I began softly, "your neighbors heard some noise. Do you have the TV on, maybe? Or anything else that could be loud?" She didn't respond, just stood there like a doll propped against the doorway. Then we heard it. Metallic clattering from deep inside the house, like someone had dropped a whole tray of silverware onto a stone floor. The sudden noise made my heart skip a beat. Paul and I exchanged tense glances. That was definitely not the TV. My instinct screamed, "Intruder." "All right, little one, could you step outside for me?" I asked, and gently guided her onto the front porch. She slipped out, barefoot on the cold concrete, and I waved over Paul. "Paul, how about you give her one of those lollipops you keep around?" I nudged him with an elbow. He liked to suck on them when he was anxious, a habit we all teased him for. He shot me a glare, which looked almost comical in the gloom, but he dug out a lollipop and handed it to the girl. She accepted it with a small giggle, a sound that echoed strangely in the silent night. Paul led her toward the cruiser while I stood in the doorway, shining my flashlight inside. "Police," I called again into the darkness. "If anyone is in here, make yourself known." It was like staring into a void. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the house itself was suffocating. Legally, without a warrant or immediate danger, I couldn't just barge in. But the crash we heard? That was more than enough reason to suspect someone was inside. I backed away carefully and joined Paul and the girl by the patrol car. "So you said your name was?" "Maribel," she whispered, voice barely carrying. That's a lovely name, I replied, hoping to put her at ease. Can you tell me where your family is? Any relatives around? Before she could say a word, a burst of static shattered the silence. We spun around and saw the television inside the living room flare to life, its volume cranked so high that the distorted, white noise tore through the night air. It made my ears ring. Paul and I instinctively pushed Maribel into the back seat of the cruiser. Policy states no. Civilian rides in the front. She sat quietly, her dark eyes locked on the house, as though she were waiting for something. We exchanged a glance of shared dread. Against our better judgment, we ventured back inside to investigate. The moment we crossed the threshold, every light switch we tried was dead. The living room was illuminated only by the chaotic static on the TV screen. Broken images danced across the screen, twisted shapes that barely resembled faces or forms. It was disorienting, like stepping into some surreal, nightmarish painting. We fanned out, moving slowly. I spotted reflections in a large mirror on the wall, fleeting glimpses of a figure that vanished whenever I turned around. At first, I thought it was Paul's reflection, but each time I pivoted, I found him on the opposite side of the room. And the figure in the mirror was taller, thinner, arms too long to be human. Tension coiled in my gut. My flashlight beam trembled over the furniture, revealing old photographs on the mantel. I squinted at them. A family of 3, father, mother, child. But, as my eyes adjusted, I realized something was off. The mother looked faint in each picture, like she was half erased. And in none of them did I see a girl who looked like Maribel. Suddenly, a rush of footsteps thundered toward us from somewhere down the hall. They were heavy, frantic, the distinct sound of boots hitting the floor. We drew our service weapons, adrenaline surging, hearts racing. Police! I barked, voice echoing unnaturally. Show yourself! The footsteps closed in, impossibly loud, and then nothing. No one emerged from the darkness. Instead, the house erupted in chaos. Chairs toppled, lamps flew off tables, pictures crashed to the ground, glass shattering across the floor. It was as if some invisible, furious creature was hurtling through the rooms, throwing everything in its path. The footsteps closed in, impossibly loud, and then nothing. No one emerged from the darkness. Instead, the house erupted in chaos. Chairs toppled, lamps flew off tables, pictures crashed to the ground, glass shattering across the floor. It was as if some invisible, furious creature was hurtling through the rooms, throwing everything in its path. Paul and I staggered backward, nearly colliding with each other. My mind reeled, desperate for a logical explanation, a draft, an earthquake, anything, but none of it fit. The air seemed electric, humming with malevolence. We fled to the porch in a stumbling panic. That's when our cruiser's siren exploded to life, wailing so loudly it seemed to vibrate my bones. Paul and I shared a look of raw shock. I rushed to silence the siren, flipping switches until it died away, leaving a ringing in my ears. Paul had gone pale, his knuckles white around his flashlight. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "You all right, partner?" He unwrapped a lollipop, popped it in his mouth, and nodded stiffly. "Yeah," he muttered. Around the candy, though sweat beaded his forehead. I opened the back door to check on Maribel. She stared straight ahead, her face unreadable. I asked if she was okay. She simply nodded, lips pressed together. I felt uneasy under her gaze, but I couldn't dwell on it. Paul called me aside. "Something's not right, Mike," he whispered, teeth practically clenching the lollipop stick. "All those pictures inside the house. Maribel's nowhere in them. Not a single frame. I frowned. Could be old photos, maybe. People move, families change. He shook his head. That place had photos from different years, including pretty recent ones. She's not in any. It's like she doesn't exist. I glanced at the house and back at Maribel. Then what are you suggesting? He ran a shaky hand over his face. I don't know. All I do know is that everything started happening the moment we took her outside. The TV blasts static, we go in, and something tries to scare us away. Then that presence sets off the siren of all buttons. Like it was searching for her. I resisted the urge to snap at him, to call him a superstitious fool. But the memory of that monstrous figure in the mirror and the invisible rampage was still fresh. We can't just leave her alone, I said finally. But we can't pretend this isn't happening either. Paul turned on his heel and strode back into the house. I followed, half wanting to grab him and drag him away from this cursed place. In the front hallway, he grabbed a hardcover book from a nearby side table and smashed it into the largest mirror he could find, sending shards flying. Are you nuts? I hissed. That's property damage, he finished for me. I know, but that thing shows up in mirrors. Maybe we can lure it or spot it clearly. He handed me a shard of broken glass, the edges sharp enough to draw blood with a careless touch. Stay alert, he murmured. It's not every day you hunt a ghost. We both aimed our flashlights, the beams reflecting off the fractured pieces. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. A twisted part of me hoped we'd see nothing. Maybe it was all in our heads. We both aimed our flashlights, the beams reflecting off the fractured pieces. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. A twisted part of me hoped we'd see nothing. Maybe it was all in our heads. No such luck. In one jagged shard, I saw it, a figure with elongated limbs, its skin a crimson shade that seemed to pulse as if lit from within by a sickly glow. Its face was more skull than flesh, eyes like black pits. My throat clamped in fear. I spun around, but before I could fully face it, a searing pain tore across my back. It felt like clawed fingers raking through my uniform into the flesh beneath. I gasped and stumbled, dropping my shard. It shattered on impact, bits of glass scattering. Another slash raked across my side, and I choked on a cry. It felt like pure demonic hatred, slicing into me. Paul yelled something I couldn't make out, then fired his weapon. The muzzle flash lit up then. Darkness like a strobe, illuminating a silhouette as it screeched, a sound that nearly made my teeth rattle out of my skull. The presence vanished into the gloom, leaving behind a silence that felt almost suffocating. Paul grabbed me by the arm, half dragging me back outside. My pulse thundered, and every wound burned. I clutched my side, trying not to collapse. When we reached the cruiser, both of us nearly collapsed onto the hood. My gut twisted when I glanced into the back seat. It was empty. Maribel was gone. Explaining the events of that night to our superiors was a nightmare in itself. We filed a police report as professionally as we could, but how do you put invisible entity assaulted officers into official paperwork without sounding like a lunatic? The cruiser's dashboard camera, which might have saved us, offered no help. The footage was blank from the moment we stepped into the house. Something, or someone, had disabled it. Our captain dismissed most of our account, though he took interest in our mention of Maribel. That name came up in a missing persons report a week ago, he said, sliding a file across the desk. The photograph on the top page made my heart freeze. It was the same little girl we'd seen that night. The same dark eyes, the same blank stare. With no concrete evidence, the department had little choice but to rule our story as an unexplained disturbance. But I knew the truth. I saw it in the mirror, felt its claws tear into my flesh. Paul and I tried to carry on as usual, but you can't unsee something like that. My nights were plagued by nightmares, my days haunted by unshakable paranoia. A few days after the incident, I turned in my badge. I told them it was for personal reasons. But the real reason was simple. I was terrified. This wasn't just a break-in or a murder scene. This was something beyond human comprehension. And it was still out there somewhere, chasing a lost little girl named Maribel, who might not have even been alive in the first place. I'm writing this for anyone who might scoff at the idea of the supernatural, anyone who thinks they know where reality ends and nightmare begins. Believe me, there are things in the dark far more dangerous than any criminal on the streets. They can toy with your senses, twist your mind, and leave you questioning your own sanity. I'm writing this for anyone who might scoff at the idea of the supernatural, anyone who thinks they know where reality ends and nightmare begins. Believe me, there are things in the dark far more dangerous than any criminal on the streets. They can toy with your senses, twist your mind, and leave you questioning your own sanity. So, if you ever hear footsteps behind you when you're alone at night, or see a door open on its own with no breeze, don't just shrug it off. Keep your eyes on every mirror and be wary of static on late-night televisions. Because sometimes, the things that reach out from beyond aren't interested in scaring you. They're interested in taking you. And when they do, you might just vanish like a whisper in the dark, leaving nothing behind but a shattered reflection or a brief entry in a missing persons file. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Don't forget to like and click the bell.